Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start with our content. So this is really the first of content lecture of Geology 101. And we're going to have some really basic stuff to cover. So first of all, I wanted to talk about the focus of the class. This is something we hinted at in a previous video. So this class focuses on essentially how we use geology, right? So there are a lot of classes that we can take that really talk about how the Earth works, right? The kind of nuts and bolts of geology. And in this class, we're really going to kind of back off of that and focus on how we use geology to our benefit. So it's really the kind of human interaction, not including the human interaction of like hazards, right? We have a special course that deals with that. So the goal, really, if I were to kind of outline a goal, it's actually kind of three parts. So one of the things that I found, and it's a little bit of an inspiration for this class, is that not very many people fully understand kind of where their world comes from, right? Where the built environment comes from, where the gas comes from in your car, where the plastic fork that you're using for your Chinese food comes from. And so really, we're going to explore all of that in this class. And so the goal, like I said, really in three parts. The first thing that we're going to analyze for any particular resource is geologically how it occurs, right? So again, we will have to brush up on some nuts and bolts of kind of how the Earth works and some geological basics. But we'll talk about geologically how that resource is developed or how it forms. The second thing that we're going to talk about, and this kind of dabbles into engineering a little bit, is how do we extract that resource, right? So what sorts of processes do we do to go get that resource? Sometimes it's as simple as scooping it into a bucket and taking it away. Other times it's much more complicated, and you hear about things like fracking and strip mining and those sorts of things in the news. But we'll examine how that works and how that's changed over time. And then the last thing that we're going to kind of think about as a goal is really understanding the problems that are associated with a particular resource. Really actually the benefits and the problems. So, some resources have more of an impact on our planet than others. Some have particular benefits. And so for each one, we're going to kind of highlight that. So really the goals are learn about the geological occurrence, think about how it's extracted, and start to address some of the problems. Now, at this point, those are kind of the geo goals. Additionally, and hopefully you're aware, this class is also designated as a Global Perspectives class, which means we at CWI require students to take one Global Perspectives class at some point in their college career. This can be yours. You actually can choose whether you count it as a Global Perspectives or your science elective, right? So it gives you some wiggle room with your courses. But because of that, we're also going to focus on some of the more humanistic or political aspects of geology with particular reference to resources. So really we can kind of think about our personal use. We'll do a couple of assignments which highlight and kind of quantify the resources that we use. We'll even do a little challenge that makes an attempt at reducing the resources that we use in our daily lives. We'll also talk about politics, right? So politics is a big part of this. There's resource-rich countries and resource-poor countries. There's countries with different laws governing resources. And so there is a lot of this global politics, or we call it geopolitics, that revolves around resources and actually nations' wealth, right? And oftentimes that's directly tied to the resources. It's a fairly cliche way to start, but what is a resource, right? We got to have a basic definition. So I think intellectually, when you think about resources, you could, a few things probably pop into your mind's eye. Coal, oil, natural gas. Those are kind of one category of resources. Sand and gravel, right? That's a resource. Concrete, birds and trees and elk and whales and fish. All of those things are considered natural resources. And the fundamental definition actually encompasses all of those. So the basic definition that I like, and the one that we're going to go with in this class, is a resource is something or could be considered a resource, materials that occur in nature, so they occur naturally, that can be used for economic gain. So again, that covers all the things we were just describing, right? Groundwater, fish. I don't know why I picked on whales earlier, but fish, trees, oil, sand and gravel, gold, metals, and all sorts of those things fall into this category. So they're things that occur naturally, and we can use them for economic gain, right? We can make the big bucks. Hopefully you've been able to see, throwing around a lot of terms and thrown up a lot of different, resources. One of the things that we're going to focus on is actually to categorize those resources. At least start thinking about what sorts of resources there are. So the beginning of the class, we're actually going to spend quite a bit of time talking about energy resources. So things that we can extract or use, right? Remember, materials that occur naturally that can be used for economic gain, right? Our great definition of resource. Energy resources are those in which we can use to essentially generate electricity. Sometimes it's a little bit more complicated than that. There's kind of the three big fossil fuels that probably pop right into your mind: coal, oil, natural gas, right? We'll talk a lot about those. There's also uranium as an energy resource, hydroelectric, right? Water as a resource, wind and solar, right? Wind as a resource, so the sun, so energy from the sun, radiation from the sun as a resource. So all of those, in a way, can be folded into the category of energy resources. A little bit later in the semester, once we've finished our energy resources, we'll actually then talk about metals as a resource. So here, again, the first thing that might pop into your mind is gold or silver, the basement of Fort Knox with all of these gold bricks stacked to the ceiling. But really, the one metal that's probably the most important is iron. And then from iron, we mix other metals with it to create alloys, and we create steel. Steel, in many ways, rules the world, right? It's always in the news. Steel tariffs this or steel production. We're thinking about all the politics and all the stuff involved with the creation of steel. But in many ways, our world is made out of metal, right? Our cars, the structure of our buildings, right? The skeletons of our buildings, all of that are made out of metals. And really, the heaviest hitter, far and away, is iron, which we use as the primary ingredient in the creation of steel. So the next category is life-supporting resources. This sounds medical, but it's not. Maybe a preferred term would be our built environment. So sand and gravel, concrete, gypsum, agricultural resources, right? So things that we use for fertilizer. There's really this is kind of a pretty big catch-all term of life-supporting resources. And we'll kind of pick and choose a few as we go through that part of the discussion. So water and soil, again, agriculture is incredibly reliant on both of these. And lots of other things are, right? We even talked about using water as an energy resource. So we'll also see that some things might occupy different spaces in the list here. The last one we'll deal with is biological resources. So again, trees, right? Again, most of us live in houses that are a wooden structure, a wooden skeleton. We use paper all the time. Just trying to think, those are really just trees. But then we have fish and food and all of those sorts of resources that could also tie into the biological side. So really, these are the 5 primary categories of resources that we'll deal with in the class. Additionally, once we start looking at individual resources, some individual resources or a specific resource, there's also another way to categorize them, and it really has to do with how that resource is formed, and it ultimately lends itself to the designation of renewable versus non-renewable. So renewable resource is something that has recharge. That's keyword. It recharges at a rate that is useful to humans. So trees are a really good example of this, right? So we manage our forests. We can go out and we can recover a certain percentage of trees, and those trees grow at a certain rate. And so as long as we're matching the recharge rate with the usage rate, that's actually kind of even further what we would call sustainable use of a renewable resource. We could have a renewable resource, again, a tree would be categorized as such, or a forest really. But then we could have unsustainable use of a renewable resource, meaning you're using it faster than the recharge. Like you go in and clear cut a forest, right? That's not sustainable use of a renewable resource. Again, the key here is recharge rate. We can think about groundwater as another example, right? So aquifers, we'll talk about that later in the semester, they recharge at a rate. We use that water largely for agriculture and for drinking water, and we need to make sure that we're not using that at a greater rate than it's recharged, which we often overuse it, we use it unsustainably. It's actually more common than not. So the next category are resources that we consider non-renewable, meaning that they don't have a recharge rate that is relevant to the human life, or the human lifespan, I guess, or humanity. You could cut that up all sorts of different ways. Coal, right? So the majority of the coal that we use was actually developed during the Carboniferous time. We'll talk about that way later in the semester. About 300 million years ago, we had this that's when our coal peak is. And for that coal to actually be compressed and kind of geologically modified to the point that it is this resource we can use, that takes millions of years for that to develop. So there are places where we see on Earth kind of that in stages along its development, but it doesn't renew at any appreciable rate that's useful to us. So coal is a resource that's non-renewable, meaning if you were to extract it, you just go and take the coal because the coal is there. There's no new coal being produced. You take it, you use it. Once you use it, the coal is gone, right? So it doesn't have a recharge rate. And that's just one example. Many of the things we'll talk about in this class are considered non-renewable. So generally the metals, most energy resources, not all energy resources, life supporting, so kind of built environment things. Biological are usually considered renewable. Again, we'll have some time to examine those specifically as we go forward. The last topic in this video is going to be who has them, as in who has the resources. And this is an example of politics, right? So what I mean by who has them, really that's another way of saying where are they, right? So some countries are what we would call resource rich, and other countries are what we would call resource poor. And oftentimes the wealth of nations or the wealth of an individual nation is tied to their resources, right? What can they dig out of the ground and sell? Fundamentally, right? That's how it works. So the most important thing, although not the only important thing, is size. Not the size of the resource, but the size of the nation. So it should be no stretch of the imagination to think that really big countries have lots of resources, right? Because they're expansive, and as those resources occur within their national boundaries, they can go and dig them up and sell them to other countries or use them internally. The number one factor in thinking about resource wealth is really size. So we'll see if you can think about it. What's the largest country on Earth? It's Russia, right? So Russia is number one, and it should come as no big surprise. They are also the richest country when it comes to what I would call resource wealth, right? They have the most resources. I know that this sounds a little bit strange because we're kind of talking about non-specific resources, but if you kind of pool them all together in this generic resource sort of way, they have the most, and they're the largest. Just thinking about nation size, Russia's number one. The next country down the list is Canada. Although it's a really big step down the list, Russia is about 2 times the size of Canada. So Canada, also famously rich in resources. Below that is us, right? The United States. We're the 3rd largest country. And the 4th largest country is China, right? Just behind us. It's actually comparable in size to the United States. And all of those countries make an appearance on the top 10 list, right? If we were to think about, the top 10 wealthy, resource wealthy nations in the world, but they're not 1, 2, 3, and 4. There's another aspect that is a little bit more of a geological roll of the dice. So resource concentration or density might be a better way to think about this. So how dense is the area where that resource is located? Really, the easiest example to think about when we talk about resource density is oil, right? So famously, there are some very small nations that are sitting on top of very large oil reserves. And so even though those nations aren't anywhere close to the top of the list when it comes to size, in some cases they're very close to the top of the list when we start to think about resource wealth. A couple of that I could list. So when we look at the global leaders, again in this concept of resource wealth, which is a nebulous idea, we see some countries on there that aren't very large, right? We see Saudi Arabia on there at number 3. Saudi Arabia is a fairly small country, famously lots of oil. Iran, number 5 in resource wealth. Same story, right? It's actually just a neighbor right next door. Iraq, also next door, it's number 9 on the list of resource wealth. And following that, Venezuela, who always seems to be getting in trouble somehow, but the fundamentals, Venezuela is sitting on top of a huge amount of resource, particularly oil, and that in that case, it's really, that money has really kind of gotten involved in politics, and there's an incredible amount of corruption, a lot of problems in Venezuela, but nevertheless, they are in the top 10 list for resource wealth. They're probably on the top of the list of resource mismanagement and corruption, which has caused all sorts of problems there. Okay, well that's going to finish up our first module. In the next video, we're going to start talking about Earth's spheres and some of the geochemical systems and places where these occur. And as we march through, we're slowly going to just start slogging along. So I'll see you in a subsequent video. And again, if you have any information or any questions or any other information that you need from me, feel free to shoot me an email. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.